Hi, so this is Mr. Baver, and we are going on to video lecture number 2 of the Great Depression. So in this video lecture, our goal will be to investigate the causes of the Great Depression and how the Great Depression affected people and what our political leaders did with their power to reverse the course of the Depression. Again, as Mr. King said in the first video lecture, the Great Depression of the 1930s marked a change in the use and or role of government, a change in the size of government, and specifically government spending that gave birth or rise to the modern state. Now, we're still living with the modern state that was a product of the 1930s, though there are now many voices who want to return to the so-called glory days of the government. At the end of our studies, you will be asked to write about what you think the proper role of government is and why. But for now, let's look more closely at the Depression, which began shortly after the stock market crash of 1929. The stock market crash was an indirect cause of the Depression. It was a moment that turned a bright light on that illuminated the underlying problems that the U.S. economy was experiencing, though these problems were not widely studied and therefore not understood by most Americans. Cause 1 has to do with the distribution of income during the 1920s, a problem that we are hearing a lot about today too, really. But also the U.S. economy grew by 40% during the decades of the 1920s. But the income gains were not evenly spread among the U.S. population, causing what we call or know today as inequality. By 1929, and you need to know this fact, 5% of Americans at the top income level received 33% of total annual income. So to put that in perspective, hypothetically, let's talk about 100 workers in U.S. right now, and they make a total of $100 million, or $1 million, among them. Using this fact, then, 5 people would have made $3,300,000, while the remaining 95 would have a total of $66,000 among them. So to look at it even more closely, economists also know from studying income numbers that the bottom 40% of income level received 12.5% of that money. So while the top 5 in our example took home $3,300,000, the bottom 40 workers took home only $125,000. So if we look at income per person, the bottom 40 workers earned $3,125, while the top 5 earned $66,600, or 21 times more than the workers in the lower 40%. Thus, we see what income equality really is, and meaning that the more and more people fall behind and do not earn enough money, while fewer and fewer people take home record amounts of money. Here's one more figure also to think about. In 1920, the top 1% of the population received 12% of all income, and by 1929, the top 1% received 19%. So why is this a problem, and how does it help cause the Depression? So to answer that question, we need to remember that the 1920s saw the birth of the consumer culture. That is, buying new products for the home, for leisure, and for fun. The ad industry got going by creating demand for all the new products available on the market, and as long as people worked and had enough income, they could participate in the Great Consumer Fun Fest, which was buy, buy, buy. However, over the course of the 1920s, incomes did not keep pace, especially for a large percent of American households. It is true that many people borrowed money, now a part of our heritage, but by decade's end, they had borrowed and spent so much that, and with income stagnating or declining, many American households could no longer play the buy, buy, buy game, so they stopped buying. This is, and remains today, a huge factor in the economic collapse, a collapse of demand. That is, people willing to buy products on the market. How did this collapse in demand or loss of buyers affect businesses or corporations? As you can see, one thing is connected to another thing. What's that little song we sang as children to learn about our body? The hip bone is connected to the thigh bone, which is connected to the knee, and so on and so forth. The economy is not so much different. As consumers stopped buying, corporations stopped making, therefore few workers were needed, and this compounded the income problem. Thus, like tugging at the thread of a sweater, the whole American economy began to unravel, yet it was a gradual process that took several years until people and political leaders realized what was happening. Another contributing factor was the concentration of wealth, that is, savings. The more one earns, the more one, in theory, can save, even after participating in the spend-crazy consumer culture. However, the idea of savings, once a bedrock of American virtue, had really disappeared in the 1920s. Thus, there was a huge disparity in wealth. Economists estimate that 2.3% of American families had over 66% of all savings in the U.S., while 80% of American families had no savings at all. To compound this, many of these families with no savings had also borrowed money to purchase products, or in the case of farmers, to keep their farms going. This disparity in wealth meant that very few people in the U.S. had money to spend on goods, which again worked to destroy demand, which in turn caused businesses to stop producing, lay off workers, and the whole economy ground to a halt. Even if the 2.3% had used their savings to continue buying and keep the economy going, there were not enough of them, a problem that we also face today. To make matters worse, the 2.3% were caught up in a greed-driven mania of buying stocks in order to make even more money. Wealthy people and wealthy corporations, instead of investing in new products and paying workers better, began to lend large sums of money to Wall Street brokers, which fueled the spectacular rise in stock prices. In 1927, $3.5 billion were lent to stockbrokers, and by 1929 the figure jumped up to $8.5 billion. This money could have gone to new products, new factories or businesses, and worker salaries, which would have kept the consumer economy afloat, but as we know, it did not. The third cause, with the farming industry, also bottomed out in the 1920s. World War I was a great boon or good time for farmers as we supplied our allies with food. Prices for farm goods skyrocketed, but after the war and as our allies recovered, farm prices plunged while farm yields remained high. American farmers, again, driven by the prospect of never-ending profits, planted more fields and crops, cotton in particular, but once demand dried up, prices went into free fall and farmers had to borrow money to stay afloat. As banks began to fail or close after the Wall Street crash, they asked farmers to repay loans, which they could not do, and consequently more banks shut their doors, a serious problem for a free market economy. Without banks to handle money transactions, all things stop. The last cause moves into the international economy, which was extremely fragile after World War I. The U.S. had lent the Allies billions of dollars during the war. After the war, we lent Germany billions of dollars in 1924 under the Dawes Plan so that Germany could pay its reparations to England and France, who would then pay the U.S. As Europe's economies stagnated by the end of the 1920s, worsened by government policy in the form of tariffs or tax on important goods, European nations could no longer make payments to the U.S., which further compounded an already fragile system and helped push the United States into depression. Like the bones of the body or the spokes of a bicycle wheel, the Great Depression's causes are complex and interconnected. The main reason was, in my opinion, income equality, overproduction, and by 1930, underconsumption. Again, if you have any questions, please write them down and we will answer them next class. Thank you.